The howl in the whiteout. The wind descended like a predator, its scream echoing off the mountains. One instant, a world washed in grayscale. The next, a disorienting, snow-blinded swirl. Abigail pressed closer to the cabin window, its pane already glazed with thick rime. Furious gusts drove the dense, horizontal flakes, threatening to dismantle the very structure around her. "Damn it," she muttered, yanking the worn curtains shut. Years nestled high in the bitterroots had seasoned her to snowstorms. Yet, this one exuded a different aura, a palpable malice. The electric light stuttered, then capitulated, plunging the room into dimness, pierced only by the spectral radiance filtering through frosted glass. Abigail sighed, reaching reflexively for the candle box beneath the sink. A match flared, casting a warm, wavering light that pushed back the encroaching shadows. Blue stirred from his vigil by the cold hearth, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. He stalked to the window, inhaling at the icy barrier, ears pricked. Observing him, unease tightened its grip on Abigail. All day, Blue had been agitated, restlessly pacing and whimpering as if foreseeing the tempest's arrival. Now he commenced to wail. Not a playful yip nor a warning growl, but a drawn-out, desolate cry that reverberated through the small dwelling and into the raging wilderness. A sound steeped in utter solitude, a primal resonance with the untamed world surrounding them. Abigail shivered, the cold only a partial cause. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice almost lost in the wind's fury. Kneeling, she stroked his coarse, gray fur. He continued his lament but leaned into her touch, a tremor running through him. The sound scraped at her soul, reopening the barely healed wounds of grief. Almost a year gone since John, her husband, Sheriff Harding, vanished in that avalanche. A year of hushed tones, vacant spaces, fighting back the very despair mirrored in Blue's keening. She remembered John finding Blue as a helpless pup, abandoned near the trailhead. John, all gruff exterior and tender heart, had rescued him, nursed him back to strength, and made him his shadow. They were inseparable. John had often joked Blue's nose was sharper than any deputy. "He misses him, Abigail," John had once observed, watching Blue fix his gaze on the peaks. "He feels the loss, too." She hadn't wanted a dog. After the first husband had departed, absconding with everything but the dust under the bed, she'd sworn off attachments. Less to forfeit, she'd presumed. Then John and Blue had appeared and her carefully erected defenses had crumbled to dust. Now only Blue remained. The howling amplified, a keen, piercing lament that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's very timbers. Abigail enfolded Blue, burying her face against his warm coat. "It's all right, boy," she choked out, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Just a storm." But this felt like more than merely a storm. It was a stark reminder of all she'd relinquished, the hollowness that had claimed her spirit. And Blue, with his heightened senses, was experiencing it too, magnified by the blizzard's ferocity. The wind shrieked louder, a grotesque mimicry of Blue's sorrowful cry. Outside, the world had vanished behind a solid curtain of white. The cabin was an isolated haven in a churning ocean, cut off and exposed. Abigail knew she couldn't languish here, immobilized by sadness and dread. She needed pragmatism, a focus on survival. John would have insisted. She pushed herself upright, her back protesting. "All right, Blue," she declared, her voice regaining strength. "Let's get some wood. We're stuck here for a spell." Blue ceased his wailing, lifting his head, his amber eyes intelligent and questioning. He seemed to comprehend, sensing her resolve. He offered a tentative tail wag, then nudged her hand with his wet nose. Abigail mustered a wan smile. "Good boy," she said. "Let's show the snow what we're made of." But as she reached for the axe, the howling recommenced, louder, more frantic. This time it transcended loneliness. It was a lament infused with warning. A howl proclaiming something stalked the whiteout, something perilous. Footprints in the snow. The wind clawed at Silas, a rabid beast tearing at his threadbare coat. Each gust slammed into him, a physical manifestation of the guilt that gnawed at his insides. Snow, driven horizontally, stung his eyes, blurring the already treacherous landscape into a swirling white chaos. He pressed on, driven by a sound, a thread of hope in the deafening roar of the storm. Blue. The dog's howl, faint and ragged, had sliced through the white noise, a beacon in the abyss. It pulled at him, a desperate plea he couldn't ignore. He'd ignored too many pleas in his life. He stumbled, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. His legs burned, each step a monumental effort. Hunger gnawed at his belly, a dull, persistent ache. He hadn't eaten since, he couldn't remember. Time had dissolved in the blizzard, each hour blurring into the next. A memory, unwelcome and sharp, pierced the fog in his mind. A sun-drenched street in Harmony Creek. A young boy, no older than 10, caught between Silas and a fleeing outlaw. Silas had aimed a clean shot meant to disable. But the boy had stumbled right into the path of the bullet. The image, replayed 1,000 times in his mind, always ended the same way, with the boy's mother screaming, a sound that echoed even now in the howl of the wind. He'd handed in his badge that day, the weight of it a brand on his soul. He traded law for the long road, hoping to outrun the past, but the past, it seemed, had finally caught up. He coughed, a ragged, painful sound that sent a jolt of pain through his ribs. He tasted blood, metallic and warm. He was losing strength, and the howl, though still audible, was growing fainter. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't fail. Not again. He dug deep, summoning a reserve of will he didn't know he possessed. He pictured Abigail, her strong, capable hands, her unwavering gaze. She had seen something in him, something he thought long dead. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't let Blue down. He pushed forward, each step a testament to his stubborn refusal to surrender. The snow deepened, reaching his knees, then his thighs. He was wading through a sea of white, the cold seeping into his bones. Another memory, this one recent, surfaced. Abigail, tending to his wounds, her touch gentle, her eyes filled with concern. "You're a good man, Silas," she'd said. "Don't let the world convince you otherwise." He clung to those words, a lifeline in the storm. He crested a small rise and saw it. A faint glimmer of light, a smudge against the white. A cabin. Abigail's cabin. Hope surged through him, a burst of warmth that momentarily banished the cold. He staggered forward, his legs failing him. He was so close. The howl, clearer now, closer, spurred him on. He took one last step, then another and another. His vision blurred, the light of the cabin danced before his eyes. He reached out, his fingers brushing against rough-hewn wood. Then darkness. He collapsed against the door, the snow a cold, unforgiving blanket. He heard Blue's bark, frantic and close. He tried to speak, to call out, but his voice was lost in the wind. He was failing. He knew it. With a final surge of strength, he reached inside his coat, fumbling for the knife. He gripped the handle, the cold steel, a familiar comfort. He wouldn't die without a fight. He would crawl, he would claw, he would do whatever it took to reach Abigail, to protect her, to finally, maybe, earn a sliver of redemption. He plunged the knife into the snow beside the door, the bright glint of the blade a last, desperate marker. Shelter from the storm. The wind howled like a banshee, clawing at the cabin walls. Abigail wrestled the door shut against another gust, the latch clicking home with a final, decisive snap. Blue whined, nudging her hand with his cold nose, then padded anxiously back to the window, his ears perked, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. "Easy, boy," she murmured, though her own pulse was skittering. The storm had worsened rapidly. It was a whiteout now, the world reduced to a swirling, blinding chaos. What had started as a flurry had become a ravenous beast, threatening to swallow everything whole. Then she heard it. A sound swallowed by the wind, but distinct nonetheless. A bark, strained and desperate. Blue mirrored the call, his own howl echoing through the small cabin. Abigail grabbed her rifle, the familiar weight a small comfort. "Stay," she commanded Blue, though she knew he wouldn't. She eased the door open, the blast of wind almost ripping it from her grasp. Blue shot past her, disappearing into the swirling white. She followed, the rifle held ready, her eyes scanning the swirling snow. The dog's barks led her onward, a lifeline in the storm. Finally, she saw them. Blue, circling a dark shape slumped against a snowdrift. As she drew closer, she recognized the man. The drifter. The one she'd seen on the outskirts of town, the one with eyes that held a story she didn't want to read. He was unconscious, his face pale, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. A crimson stain bloomed on his shoulder. Blue growled, hackles raised, standing protectively between her and the fallen man. He nipped at Silas's gloved hand. Abigail hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to leave him. He was a stranger, a man she knew nothing about. Bringing him inside was an invitation to trouble, a potential danger to her and Blue. But the storm, the wound. She couldn't leave him to die. "Blue, heel," she snapped, her voice tight. The dog reluctantly obeyed, but his eyes never left the man. Dragging Silas was a struggle. He was heavier than he looked, his body limp and unresponsive. Abigail strained with the effort, her muscles burning as she pulled him toward the cabin. Blue, sensing her intent, nudged at Silas's legs, helping to push him forward. Inside, she managed to heave him onto the rough-hewn floor near the fireplace. She knelt beside him, her hand hovering over his chest, checking for breath. It was shallow, ragged, but there. She ripped open his thick coat and examined the wound on his shoulder. It looked like a knife wound, hastily bandaged, but now bleeding freely. Whoever he was running from something or someone. Blue whined, nudging her hand again. His growls were a constant undercurrent, a warning she couldn't ignore. "I know, boy," she said softly, scratching behind his ears. "I don't trust him either." But she couldn't leave him to die. Not out there. Not in this storm. It was a decision born of practicality, of a simple, unwavering sense of right and wrong, and perhaps a flicker of something else, a memory of loss, of knowing what it felt like to be utterly alone and helpless. She rummaged through her meager supplies, pulling out clean bandages and a bottle of whiskey. She'd need to clean the wound. "This is your only chance, mister," she muttered, glancing at Silas's still face. "Don't make me regret this." The wind howled again, rattling the windows. The cabin felt small, claustrophobic, filled with unspoken questions and the simmering tension between woman, dog, and the unconscious stranger who now shared their shelter from the storm. Whispers of the past. The wind howled, a banshee keening at the eaves. Abigail stirred the fire, the flames licking greedily at the fresh logs. The cabin groaned, a low, protesting sound that mirrored the ache in her own bones. Silas sat across from her, a silent sentinel, his face etched with shadows cast by the flickering light. He hadn't spoken much since the blizzard had trapped them, content to observe, to listen. "I hate storms," she said, the words barely audible above the wind's fury. She hadn't meant to speak, the confession ripped from her by the storm's insistent prodding. Silas raised an eyebrow, a flicker of curiosity in his deep-set eyes. He remained silent, waiting. Abigail took a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp wool. "Took my husband, Thomas, this kind of storm did." She stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. "He was out checking the fences. Said he wouldn't be long. A tree fell, crushed him." Her voice cracked, the memory a raw wound that refused to heal. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the relentless roar of the wind. Silas finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm sorry, Abigail." It was a simple condolence, but it was enough. She looked up at him, seeing a flicker of something in his eyes, a shared understanding of loss, of grief's enduring grip. "He was a good man," she whispered, the words a mantra against the pain. "A hard worker, loved this land." Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow visible through the small window. "Land takes what it wants." Abigail shivered, despite the fire's warmth. "It does." She hesitated, then asked, "What about you, Silas? You ever lose anyone?" He flinched, a barely perceptible movement, but it didn't escape her notice. "Everyone loses someone," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "But some losses, they change you," Abigail pressed gently. "They leave a mark." Silas stared into the fire, his jaw tight. He was a closed book, guarded, unwilling to share. She sensed a deep well of pain within him, a burden he carried alone. "I used to wear a different kind of star," he said abruptly, the words seemingly forced from him. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer any details. Abigail frowned. "Star," he sighed, a sound of weariness. "A badge. I used to be. I enforced the law." The revelation surprised her. Silas, a lawman? He seemed so removed from that now, so haunted. "What happened?" she asked, instantly regretting the question. It was too personal, too intrusive. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a darkness that made her heart ache. "Things happened. Things I'm not proud of. Things that changed me." He paused, then added, his voice barely a whisper, "Some things, some sins, they can't be washed away." He stood abruptly, turning his back to her. "I'll take the first watch." He walked to the window, his silhouette a stark outline against the swirling white. Abigail watched him, a strange mix of pity and curiosity swirling within her. He was a broken man, haunted by his past, just as she was haunted by hers. They were two souls adrift, caught in the storm's relentless grip, seeking solace in the warmth of a shared fire. She rose and quietly went to the cupboard. She grabbed a bottle of the apple brandy she usually saved for medicinal purposes and poured 2 generous shots. She offered one to Silas. He hesitated, then accepted it, his fingers brushing hers. A spark, fleeting and fragile, passed between them. They drank in silence, the brandy burning a path down their throats. A small comfort against the storm's relentless fury. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, whispering secrets of the past, and perhaps, just perhaps, hinting at a future neither of them could yet imagine. Eyes in the dark. The bottom of the flour sack scraped against Abigail's fingernails. She appended it over the mixing bowl, a pathetic dusting of white settling inside. Silas watched her from his seat by the fire, the flames reflecting in the depths of his dark eyes. Even the meager stew she'd made yesterday had vanished, devoured with a desperation that had left a hollow ache in his gut. "That's it then," she said, her voice flat. Blue whined, nudging her hand with his wet nose, sensing her distress. She scratched behind his ears, a small, familiar comfort in the face of a growing crisis. Silas rose, his joints protesting the damp cold that had seeped into the cabin's bones. "I can go out, hunt something." Abigail shook her head, the movement sharp and decisive. "Not in this. You wouldn't last an hour. The wind alone would strip the warmth from you." She glanced towards the window where the storm raged on, a white, howling beast clawing at the glass. "Besides, even if you could see, what would you hunt? Everything's holed up, waiting for it to pass." "We can't just wait," Silas countered, his voice low but firm. "We'll starve." "We have some dried berries," she said, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "And I think there might be some smoked fish left in the cellar." "Enough for how long?" The hope died. "A day. Maybe 2 if we ration." Silas walked to the window, peering out into the swirling white chaos. He could feel the pull of the storm, the wild, untamed energy that resonated with something deep within him. He'd faced worse. But this was different. He wasn't just responsible for himself now. He turned back to Abigail, his gaze meeting hers. "I'll risk it." "No," she said, her voice rising in protest. "It's too dangerous." "Then what do you suggest?" The silence stretched, broken only by the howling wind and the crackling fire. Blue padded over to Silas, sniffing at his boots, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "I'll think of something," Abigail said finally, her voice strained. "Just give me time." Silas nodded, but he knew time was a luxury they couldn't afford. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the latch. "What are you doing?" Abigail asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Just checking the perimeter," he said, opening the door a crack and stepping out into the teeth of the storm. The wind slammed into him, stealing his breath and stinging his skin with icy needles. He pulled his collar up, squinting against the blinding white. He didn't venture far, staying close to the cabin wall, his hand guiding him along the rough-hewn logs. The snow was already knee-deep, obscuring everything. Then he saw them. Tracks large, distinct paw prints pressed deep into the snow. Too big for a fox. Too deliberate for a deer. Wolf. He followed the tracks for a short distance, his senses on high alert. There were several sets circling the cabin. They hadn't been there yesterday. They were growing bolder. He returned to the cabin, kicking the snow off his boots before stepping inside. Abigail watched him, her expression unreadable. "Wolf tracks," he said, his voice grim. "Several of them, circling the cabin." Abigail paled, her hand flying to her mouth. "Wolves? Here." "They're getting closer," Silas said. "Hungry, bold. The storm is driving them down from the mountains." He met her gaze, his own hard and unwavering. "The food is more than just a problem now, Abigail." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It's bait." Blue whimpered, pressing against Abigail's leg, his hackles raised. He knew. He could smell them. Eyes in the dark, watching, waiting. The pack gathers. The wind shrieked a mournful cry, flinging shards of ice across the landscape. Bent low against the assault, Silas trudged onward. Each blast threatened to strip away his threadbare defenses, each step a struggle against the mounting drifts. He had to return with something to alleviate Abigail's despair, to fill the gaunt spaces in her face. A hare perhaps, or even a snow-addled grouse. He cursed the rashness that had delivered them to this precarious edge. Guilt, a persistent shadow, gnawed like frostbite. He banished it, concentrating solely on survival. The woods, once a source of solace, now felt predatory, its bare boughs like grasping claws. He scrutinized the frosted ground, his breath blooming in the frigid air. Time bled away with each gust. He needed to reach the cabin before dark. Inside, Abigail coaxed the fire, its warmth a fragile haven against the encroaching cold. Blue paced restlessly, a low whine rumbling in his chest, his ears constantly pivoting. Something was wrong. She knelt, burying her face in the thick fur of his neck. "It's all right, boy," she whispered, the words thin and unconvincing. "He'll be back." The initial warning was subtle, a guttural murmur barely audible above the wind's howl. Then, a fleeting shadow at the wood's edge. Blue went rigid, the fur on his spine bristling. Abigail lunged to her feet, snatching the axe Silas had propped by the door. They materialized like specters from the swirling snow, eyes burning with a hunter's hunger. 5 wolves, gaunt and scarred, led by a massive alpha, Jedediah, whose gaze held a chilling intelligence. He peeled back his lips in a silent threat, a promise etched in razor-sharp teeth. Blue, fear warring with his resolve, positioned himself as a bulwark between Abigail and the pack. His bark, a defiant challenge, echoed across the white expanse. The attack was a furious storm. The wolves exploded forward, a maelstrom of tooth and claw. Blue met them head-on, a whirlwind of gray fur and furious snaps. He was overmatched, but his spirit burned bright. He dodged and weaved, harassing their flanks, drawing their aggression away from the cabin's flimsy barrier. A young she-wolf, quicker than the others, slipped past him, aiming for Abigail. With a roar of fury, Blue intercepted, smashing into her with bone-jarring force. They rolled in the snow, a chaotic tangle. Abigail, heart hammering against her ribs, raised the axe, her hands trembling violently. Jedediah watched, his eyes like chips of ice, calculating his advantage. He circled, biding his time, knowing the dog's stamina would fail, knowing the woman was exposed. Blue, blood staining the snow, refused to concede. He growled, a primal sound of unwavering devotion. He would shield her even at the cost of his own life. The cabin was her sanctuary, and he, her unwavering guardian. Siege. The reek assaulted him first, a savage, bestial odor that hooked into his sinuses. Terror, a glacial spike, shattered Silas's weariness. He sprinted, his lungs burning with each icy draft. The cabin materialized, a somber stain against the snow-blanketed world, yet something felt profoundly amiss. Phantoms flickered around its perimeter, too many shapes, too streamlined and earth-hugging to be human. Canines. A harsh growl tore through the silence as he neared the clearing's edge. A hulking, gray wolf, fangs exposed in a silent threat, lunged. Silas evaded the attack with a desperate agility, deploying his knife in a single, practiced move. The wolf stumbled, snarling anew, its gaze blazing with predatory fervor. There was no time for subtlety. He thrust forward, plunging the blade into the beast's chest. It collapsed onto the snow, its crimson lifeblood painting the pristine surface. More wolves materialized from the shadows of the trees, encircling him, their eyes glittering like frozen shards. A dozen at least. For too many. Blue's desperate yelps echoed from within the cabin, a frenzied counterpoint to the canine's menacing rumbles. Abigail remained inside. He bellowed, a primal sound that startled even him, and charged. He needed to breach their defenses. 2 wolves pounced in unison. He lashed out, connecting with one's jaw, sending it tumbling. The other clamped down on his forearm. He bit back a scream, twisting and slamming the creature against a sturdy pine. Its hold weakened, and he wrenched free, crimson droplets spotting the snow. The pack intensified their assault, a relentless surge of muscle and tooth. He battled back with the fury of the trapped, his knife a flashing arc of steel. A direct confrontation would be a death sentence. He needed to shift the odds. Retreating slowly, he lured the wolves away from the cabin's entrance, towards the denser timber. He knew this ground intimately. He knew the subtle hollows, the fallen boughs, the treacherous slick patches. He could exploit them. He directed them into a shallow ravine, the steep inclines offering a precarious advantage. He scaled the embankment, gaining a precious few feet of elevation. The pack pursued, their claws scrabbling for purchase. He kicked loose a cascade of snow and ice, sending it tumbling down on them, momentarily disrupting their advance. He noticed a stand of birches, their pale trunks a stark contrast to the encroaching gloom. He scrambled toward them, knowing his course of action. He recalled how wolves drove caribou into drifts where they floundered. He had to replicate that scenario. He began hacking at the base of the trees, dislodging the snow, initiating a miniature avalanche. The wolves, sensing his intent, surged ahead. He dodged and feinted, drawing them deeper into the snare. With a final, desperate heave, he triggered a substantial section of snow. It roared down the defile, entombing the wolves in a frigid white grave. It wouldn't contain them for long. He bolted back toward the cabin, adrenaline searing through his veins. He could still hear Blue's frenzied barks, punctuated by Abigail's piercing, terrified cries. He burst through the doorway, his knife aloft, braced for whatever awaited him within. The Alpha's fall. Silas knew the cabin wouldn't hold. Not against that many. He had to draw them away, give the others a chance. The widow, the children, they deserved that much. He pulled the heavy bearskin coat tighter, the scent of smoke and pine clinging to the worn fur. He checked the rifle, the knife strapped to his thigh. Enough. It had to be. He slipped out the back, the snow crunching softly under his boots. The wind howled, a mournful cry that mirrored the wolf's hunger. He moved quickly, angling away from the cabin, towards the denser woods bordering the frozen lake. Reaching the tree-line, he pulled a pine branch down, snapping it with a loud crack. The sound carried, a challenge thrown into the night. A guttural growl answered. Then another, closer. Silas grinned, a grim, joyless expression. They were coming. He plunged into the woods, moving with a speed that belied his weariness. He could hear them gaining, their heavy paws pounding the snow, their breath clouding the frigid air. He risked a glance back. 506, and leading them, a monstrous shadow of fur and teeth, was Jedediah. Silas stopped in a small clearing, a natural amphitheater of snow-laden trees. He dropped the rifle, knowing a ranged fight was useless against such speed. He drew the knife, the steel gleaming dully in the faint moonlight. He waited, breathing deeply, centering himself. The years of drifting, the fights, the hunts, all of it led to this. Jedediah exploded from the trees, a blur of gray fury. He was bigger than Silas remembered, his eyes burning with feral intelligence. He lunged, teeth bared, aiming for Silas's throat. Silas sidestepped, the wind from the wolf's passing ruffling his hair. He slashed out with the knife, catching Jedediah's flank. The wolf snarled, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated in Silas's chest. The pack encircled them, a silent, watchful audience. Jedediah ignored them, his focus solely on Silas. He feinted left, then right, testing Silas's defenses. Silas remained still, his eyes locked on the Alphas. He knew he had to be patient, to wait for his opportunity. Jedediah attacked again, this time lower, aiming for Silas's legs. Silas jumped, the wolf's teeth snapping shut inches below his boots. He landed heavily, the impact jarring his bones. He used the momentum to launch himself forward, driving the knife deep into Jedediah's shoulder. The wolf howled, a sound of pure agony and rage. He reared back, thrashing wildly, trying to dislodge the knife. Silas held on, his grip tightening on the hill. He twisted the blade, feeling the resistance of bone and muscle. Jedediah bucked, throwing Silas off. Silas landed hard, the wind knocked out of him. He scrambled back to his feet, breathing raggedly. Jedediah stood before him, a massive, bleeding beast. But his eyes, they were losing their fire. Silas knew he had him. He just had to finish it. He charged, a roar tearing from his throat. He dodged Jedediah's clumsy swipe and plunged the knife into the wolf's heart. Jedediah shuddered, his massive frame collapsing to the snow. The pack scattered. They had seen their leader fall. Their loyalty, their pack discipline, broken in an instant. They vanished into the woods, shadows melting into the darkness. Silas stood alone in the clearing, the wind whipping around him. He pulled the knife from Jedediah's chest, wiping it clean on the dead wolf's fur. His own side throbbed, a searing pain that told him Jedediah hadn't gone down without a fight. He pressed a hand to the wound, feeling the sticky warmth of blood. He staggered, his legs threatening to buckle. He needed to get back to the cabin, to make sure they were safe. He started walking, each step a monumental effort. The whiteout swirled around him, blurring the line between the world and the void. He kept moving, driven by a single, unwavering purpose. He had bought them time. He just hoped it was enough. A new dawn. Blue's frantic barking clawed at the edges of Abigail's focus. She ignored him, her tongue caught between her teeth as she cleaned the gash on Silas's arm. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls, illuminating the grim set of her jaw. He hadn't flinched, not once, as she'd probed the wound for debris. He just watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. "Hold still," she murmured, dabbing at the wound with a clean, albeit tattered, cloth soaked in diluted whiskey. He remained motionless. "Thank you," he finally rasped, his voice rough from disuse. Abigail didn't meet his gaze. "Don't thank me yet. Still have to stitch it." She threaded the needle, the gut shining faintly in the dim light. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken things. The men he'd killed, the life she'd lost, the storm that still howled outside, a caged beast desperate to break free. "Why?" he asked, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. She pricked his skin with the needle. "Why what? Why help me?" Abigail paused, her hand hovering. "Because you saved me. From them. And from the cold." She resumed stitching, her movements precise. "Besides," she added, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips, "I wouldn't want Blue to think I'm heartless." He watched her intently, his gaze unnerving in its intensity. "I'm not a good man, Abigail." She tied off the stitch, snipping the thread with a small pair of shears. "Maybe not. But you're here. And you're alive. That's enough for now." She moved to his side, gently probing the bruising around his ribs. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath. "Cracked, maybe," she diagnosed, wrapping his torso tightly with bandages. "Try not to breathe too deep." He nodded, his face pale. "What will you do?" he asked, his voice strained. "Do? When the storm breaks. Will you turn me in?" Abigail straightened, finally meeting his gaze. The question hung between them, a fragile thing. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the deep lines etched around his mouth, the burden he carried like a physical weight. She also saw something else, something unexpected. A flicker of hope. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I won't." His breath hitched. "Why?" "Because," she said, her gaze unwavering, "I think you've suffered enough." She turned away, stirring the fire. "Besides, I could use the company." Blue, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, quieted, whimpering softly near the door. The storm raged on through the night, a furious symphony of wind and snow. But inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Abigail felt it in the shared silence, in the glances exchanged across the flickering firelight, in the quiet understanding that bloomed between them. As the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, Silas stirred. He sat up slowly, wincing, and reached into his coat. He pulled out a leather pouch, its contents glinting faintly in the emerging light. Badges, tarnished, worn, but undeniably badges of office. He held them in his palm for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he walked to the fire and tossed them in. The flames licked at the metal, turning them a dull, angry red. Abigail watched, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and hope. It was done. He was free. As if in response, the wind outside began to die down. The snow stopped falling. A sliver of pale sun peeked through the clouds, painting the landscape in soft, ethereal light. The storm had broken. Silas stood by the fire, watching the badges melt into the embers. He turned to Abigail, a faint smile gracing his lips. "A new dawn," he said, his voice stronger now. Abigail nodded, her own heart lifting with a fragile sense of possibility. Blue barked once, a happy, relieved sound, and scratched at the door. Abigail unlatched it, and the dog bounded out into the pristine snow, eager to explore the world reborn. Abigail and Silas followed, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The world was silent, cleansed, and blindingly white. The air smelled of pine and snow, a promise of renewal. They stood together, side by side, watching Blue frolic in the snow, the first rays of the sun warming their faces. The past was behind them, consumed by the flames. The future stretched before them, unknown, uncertain, but shared.